Organic chemistry is an ideal platform upon which to make art. You have molecules, and some of them are really quite interesting and quite beautiful, so you can get a confluence between the science and the art. I was born in Riverdale, Florida, a town about 15 miles west of St. Augustine. My parents were both farmers. They went to school up until about the 9th grade, after which they went to work. My father always found ways to make a living, although he was not well educated. My grandfather was also a farmer, and he was a migrant worker. One of my fabulous experiences was when I was around 5. I went by truck from St. Augustine to New Jersey to pick tomatoes. Well, of course, I went to segregated schools. The very first school was Webster School, which is now a historic site. The one thing which was so beautiful about the building was that it had a tin roof. I remember it distinctly because I lived in a house that had a tin roof. It had a kind of a bronze rusty feeling, which was quite beautiful to me. The beaches surely were segregated, and we knew it. Our family had to travel for about 18 miles to go to a beach that would accept us. The thing was, it was a very beautiful beach, very white sands, and when one goes back today, we find that the beach where we went is by far the most beautiful beach of the beaches in that area. So, to separate the races, people would do almost anything. For example, sacrificing seeing the wonderful white sands of St. Augustine beaches. My first experience with science, knowing that it was indeed science that we were dealing with, was somewhere around the 8th grade in physical science class. We were doing some experiments dealing with the pendulum. For me, the thing that was most attractive about that experience was the movement of the pendulum and not the physics of the movement of the pendulum. And often throughout my life, the things that have affected me greatly have been visual movement of things. I went to high school in St. Augustine at a place called Excelsior. It was about a 2.5 mile walk from my house there in St. Augustine. I found it much more pleasant to walk to school rather than take the bus. This gave me a lot of time to be alone, and I enjoyed my company. It's perhaps a peculiar way of putting it, but I did, and I think this played a role in my becoming a scientist eventually. I somehow found the space and the time to spend with myself, to do thinking, sometimes of a critical nature, but sometimes not. Believe it or not, I played football. I was not, in my mind, a very good player. On the other hand, I tried, and I think this follows my life throughout. I was always willing to give things a try. And I think that in my science and math related classes, the key was to give it all that I had intellectually. My mother worked on a flower farm. It was during the summer. I spent some time working on the same flower farm. One day, the foreman came to me and asked would I work the Saturday following the Friday. And I told him that I had made plans and wouldn't be able to work. And he says, that's too bad because I really want you to work and it won't be pleasant for you. So he went to my mother and said, I've asked your son to work tomorrow, and he said, no, he has something to do. And she said, well, he makes up his own mind about those issues, and so you'll have to work it out with him. For me, that was a tremendous vote of confidence. She said she simply felt that I had made a decision and it should hold. That kind of support meant a lot for me throughout my life, actually. That's where it started anyway. And it also resulted in a fairly high degree of independence as a person. The one college which impressed me was Clark, Atlanta. Spent some time there. Later on, the dean of that college came to St. Augustine and presented a talk about the school. And I said, boy, this is a great place. So I decided that maybe this was one of the places I should consider. The question was, what financial aid could one expect there? And the answer was, well, it depends upon how good you are. In our case, there were 2 scholarships available. One had been presented to one of the women students, and the other had been given to one of the male students. He was not able to consider the scholarship, and therefore, by default, I got it. But that was not enough to get me on my way. So the question was there any possibility of work offered at the school? The chemistry department offered jobs to students in the chemical storeroom, and I took it. And so that made all the difference, the scholarship and the money from working in the laboratory at the school. So that's how I ended up at Clark College.
There's a school on a hill that we love good and true.
Clark College and the other colleges in the University Center are landscaped quite beautifully. When I arrived there as a student, it was late summer, early fall, and was still quite beautiful. So, very positive impression. There was Mr. Simpson and Dr. Spriggs, basically 2 instructors in chemistry. They were phenomenal teachers. They were really interested in their students. And you just got that right away. These people came from backgrounds where after college they looked around for jobs. And jobs were not available to black scientists in the 50s. They just were not. Nevertheless, both of them were able to get jobs in education, and in this particular case, Clark College. And in spite of the disappointment that they must have felt being rejected from places where they wanted to work, they took the position that we are going to make sure that the next generation is well trained. And so they saw that as their mission. Mr. Simpson basically taught general chemistry, and Dr. Spriggs went on from there to analytical, to biochemistry, and to more advanced courses. And I felt that I was getting the very best. By the time I took advanced organic chemistry, I was a honors student, and it was an amazing experience. It was challenging, and at the same time fun. You had to be prepared when you went off to class. You could not hide at all. And I think that I was really prepared once I had gotten through classes with Dr. Spriggs. I scored above 90% of people in this nation in the graduate record exam. And it was just based on doing well in the sciences, but also in the other fields. And I just felt challenged and pushed. My English professor was M. Carl Holman. His impact was profound on me. Most of the music I listen to is classical. I like some jazz, but for the most part, it's classical. And that came out of the experience that I had in Mr. Holman's class. He was an amazing professor. In addition to his interest in literature and English, he was very much interested in civil rights. During that period of time, there were a number of people, faculty, who were really afraid of getting involved in civil rights. It was a touchy area. The older people wanted to stay away from it. The younger people, therefore, were a little hesitant, except for M. Carl and just a very few others. He got heavily involved, and he ended up in Washington, D.C., working for the Urban Coalition, made tremendous contributions. It was Clark's loss.
The man who owns this restaurant intends to keep Negroes out of it. The Negroes are getting increasingly impatient, especially the young ones. This year, Negro students in the South have organized a series of demonstrations which have become known as sit-ins.
In 1961, there was this day of protest. It involved students coming together from Clark College, Morehouse College, and Spelman to deal with the issues of segregation at lunch counters downtown, clothing stores. Students were simply fed up with it.
I talked about these demonstrations to a young Negro student who himself took part in them. Don Clark, a student of Morehouse College.
But you were in fact breaking the law, weren't you?
Yes, we were breaking the law of Georgia, but we were not breaking the law of the land, which is the Constitution of the United States.
Now, what is it that you hope to achieve by these demonstrations?
Well, actually, what we're trying to achieve is freedom along the avenues of not only in eating facilities, but also in education, in employment, and also in housing opportunities.
For the most part, the demonstrations there in Atlanta were nonviolent, although it was in the kind of early phases of the protest movements. Personally, I experienced kind of a nasty situation where some guy decided that he would give me a good pinch while I was sitting at a lunch counter. My impulse was to say, this is not right, and I'm going to do something about it. But then I thought about what our overall objectives were, and I held back.
Dear Omega girl, I love you.
Well, I was an Omega. We used to serenade the young women on campus. And so we would go out to various dormitories and stand out front, and we'd sing. I was one of the leaders. It was incredible. I think back on it. I said, you know, this is nuts. But anyway, I did it. And unfortunately, I didn't continue to sing because I think I could have been reasonably good at it. I met Harriette at Clark. First time I saw her was in the dining hall. We were standing in line for dinner. He was 18 at the time. I just took note of it, but there was nothing that came of it that particular day. But several days later, I was in the library studying, and there were these two girls who came up. Harriette was one of them. And the question was, what was your name? So she thought that Memeger was a funny name, and she let it be known. And so there you are. It's a anyway. We were formally introduced in the library. It's kind of on and off for years. It's kind of amazing that we ever really got together. When I graduated in 1961, there was a friend who gave to me her address, and so we continued a relationship. My father moved to New York first to find work in 1957, 58, and eventually my mother joined him. I knew I wanted to be kind of close to them, but in retrospect, I'm not sure it was the smartest thing, but nevertheless, I just looked around New York, and there were places like Syracuse and University of Buffalo and Adelphi, and I ended up with fellowships at Adelphi, Syracuse, and University of Buffalo. I went to Adelphi. It was closer to home. I was still quite young. I was not that sophisticated, but so there you are. I quickly settled down in one specific area, and that was nucleophilic displacement reactions. It's a wide-ranging field. I was involved in the reactions between molecules where groups could be displaced. So that was the nature of what I did for quite a while, and actually ended up with a thesis, Field Effects of Nucleophilic Displacement Reactions. Got married in 1963. The following year, we had a child, Jeanne. Our second child, Kim. He was born in 1966 when we came to Wilmington. One of the most memorable things, in addition to becoming married, was that Jeanne was a difficult child. I actually failed one of my exams. He was the noisiest baby, just incredibly disruptive. Had I had just a little sense, I would have just stayed at school until I finished my work, and then I would have gone home. But I didn't. I went home. Anyway, he kept the situation aggravated, and I failed an examination. It was not easy to take because I had never failed an examination before, but I simply started over, and it worked out just fine this second time around. Anyway, that little boy, he's a lawyer now. As a scientist, I never really thought about work and finding a job. It was kind of funny. I don't know what was in my mind, but I didn't necessarily think of going out looking for a job. But then it did occur to me that, next year after you get your PhD, you're going to have to do something. So I began in earnest, looking for a job. And one of the things that was true of the American Chemical Society was that they paid attention to their members. And one thing that they had was the Employment Clearinghouse. In 1964, I took a trip out to Chicago, and I attended several of the clearinghouses. The companies that interested me were Archer Daniel Midland and a DuPont company, both of whom asked me to consider coming to their laboratory spaces for an interview to find out whether or not there was a fit with respect to my talents and their needs. And the two people from DuPont thought that I might fit in, so they said, "Why don't you pay a visit?" So I visited them a few months later, and one of the areas where they thought there might be a fit was polymer chemistry, and found it fascinating because it was new to me. And I said, this sounds like a very interesting challenge, and I really like a challenge. I met some chemists there who were very respectful, who were from all over the world. They were truly interested in their work, and that impressed me. And so I gave a presentation of my work, and before I left that day, an offer was made to come and join them at the pioneering research laboratory of DuPont Textile Fibers Department. What was particularly attractive about this group of people was that I had every sense that it would be fair. Because I had heard some stories before I showed up which would kind of be discouraging. For example, there was a guy from Adelphi who came down to interview DuPont. And he knew that I would be coming down to pay a visit, an interview. And he said to me when he returned, he said, "So I understand that you're going down to Wilmington to interview DuPont." I said, "Yeah, that's true." He said, "It's a good company, but when I was down there, I didn't see anybody who looked like you." I said, "Well," I just took it in. And I just proceeded down to Wilmington. And my first assumption was that there were some very decent people and that they were going to accept me on my merits. And that's what happened.
Okay.
In terms of PhD chemists, there were three. There was Daniel James, and there was Claiborne Smith, who was at the experimental station. And then there was Dick Cooper, who was by far the most well-known black PhD chemist there. A very fine chemist who had serious issues with racism. He sensed discrimination, and it made him angry. One can be lucky in life and run into groups of people who are fair and turns out well. On the other hand, there are groups, people who can be really quite nasty, and he had to deal with some very, very nasty people. It was totally understandable that he felt the way he did. He worked fluoroelastomers, CalRes, which formed high-temperature seals used in jet engines. It was kind of an amazing discovery. He was not necessarily given credit for those contributions.
It looks almost like spun gold, like an alchemist's dream come true.
In the fall of 1971, there was no system available for making the molecules of Kevlar long enough that they would be useful. And what I found was a way to make the molecules longer using a system that people had tried before, but had tried in the wrong sequence, the wrong way. And so I found a way of running the reaction under conditions that would give chains that were long enough for Kevlar. That was a contribution. If one were to take this molecule and twist it in that fashion, then you no longer have a linear molecule. It's more or less like a U. So the key with Kevlar is to have all of these molecules line up right next to one another, simply repeating this molecule. So we have this paraphenylene terthylamide added to another one, and so forth and so on, until they get very, very long. That's the key. You need very long molecules in order to get strength from the material. And so that's what we achieved in our work. One of the products that we were aiming for initially was tire cord. In order to strengthen rubber, you need to add particles. And in this case, we added fiber. Another was for ballistics, bulletproof vests. There are many lives that have been saved by introducing Kevlar fiber into rubber, and in the case of ballistic, into fabric. Those are the two most important applications. I have 14 patents. The purpose of a patent is to protect those technologies which you might find to offer utility for products. Let me give you an example. On aircraft, the seats, when you take those things apart, what you discover is that you've got a Nomex Kevlar fabric, and the purpose of that cushion is for comfort and for providing flame resistance. So you can imagine that if you had a cushion that was not flame-proof, it would not be a good thing to be caught on an airplane with seating materials which are flammable. One of the things that we did was to take an ordinary Nomex paper and we blow it up using microwaves so it expands. As a result of putting in air within this flame-resistant fabric, what you discover is a product that has lighter weight and overall more flame-resistant. Their mission was to make sure that people somehow got fair treatment, especially after they were released from prison. And so one of the things that we did was to work hard to put people in a position that they would be more acceptable to coming back into society. I served on that board for probably 7 or 8 years, of which 3 were spent as chairman of the music committee. One of my proudest achievements, and I think Symphonist too, was the introduction of music by black composers. people are suspicious of newness and things that are new. And without having somebody to point out to the board, in this case, that look, there are these important compositions that are being made that we should be playing. I served on the board of the Delaware Center for the Contemporary Arts for about 6 years, something like that. And one of the significant achievements, at least from my point of view, was made at the end of my stay there. And it had to do with bringing together 35 years of contributions that the organization had made into a booklet, which is available to arts lovers. I received the Christie Award, and I forget the year now, but the aim was to credit me with contributions that I had made to various art fields. Another contribution has to do with fundraising, and I did substantial work in that area, pointing out to people who were not necessarily of great means to contribute. And so that was recognized. I began my life as an artist pretty early, actually. There are only so many hours in the day, and you work pretty hard and you come home, and there are other things that you like to do. And one thing that I decided to do was to start to draw again. I was looking at a drawing I made of my son, Zane, when he was about 2. And I looked at this drawing and I said, this is not bad. Harriette and I had begun to collect art. I was down having a chat with my supervisor, and I said to him, "Who made this painting on the wall here?" And he says, "Well, it was made by Harriette Ermentrout, and she's one of the painters that's represented by Grace McFerrin here in Wilmington." I say, "Is that so?" Every month or so, Grace McFerrin would go out into the Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia area to seek paintings that might be of interest to collectors. Every month when I would go in addition to purchasing or renting a painting, we'd have conversations about paintings. She says, "Why don't you consider making art yourself?" And one fine day, I decided that maybe I should take her up on the advice, and so I began to paint. By that time, it was around 1980 or so, and since that time, I've been painting, mostly abstracts, because not much for realism. It doesn't move me. I like it by other people, but I can't become interested enough to do it myself. This painting is organized around what happened during 9/11. There's a lot of energy associated with this swooshing here. And this line representing light. So you got energy and light flowing into a situation that was just awful. The squares are tumbling. A thing that an organic chemist sees when looking at these kinds of things is squares shouldn't just be blocks on top of one another, but there should be some sort of organization to them. Art is a peculiar language. It's not clear how you state that relationship between the art and the science. You can say make a square on a piece of paper. And it just sits there until you move it just a little bit to start to tilt it. When you start to tilt it, then it activates the space. And it activates the mind. For the last 20 years or so, I've been making paintings based on the square and the circle and how they interact. The title of the work is A Study in the Hemicycle and Square. And so if you look closely, you'll see there's a square here, here, and you'll see the circle. Circle here, here. It says something about the Frank Lloyd Wright house. Frank Lloyd Wright used a lot of hemicycles in his work, a lot of squares and blocks, and I was satisfied with it. So I called Spencer after I had made the changes, and I said, well, "Why don't you come over and take a look?" Because I was through, basically. So he came over. I said, "Well, what do you think?" He said, "Well, I love it." He stopped by with his van, and we loaded the painting in, and we took it over and hung it in the house. Weaving is her main thing right now.
This piece was done around 2002 because I didn't get interested in tapestry until about that time when we went out to New Mexico. And I found they were teaching a class there the following year. So I went back and I studied with James Kohler. And when I came home, I picked up a book and I learned how to do all the type of stitches you would consider in making a tapestry.
We collaborated at the Siegel Jewish Community Center, and so Harriette and I were invited to show work there.
The first piece over here is one that was made after I had been on a trip to Morocco. And when I wove this, I decided to put clothes over the mountain. That was a fun part. The other piece, which I did, was shown at the Delaware Art Museum in an exhibition there about 3 or 4 years ago. And this is my take of Santa Fe. So I like making small pieces. I never make anything more than 12-inch square. I like to keep it small.
I'm trying to find better ways to express the relationship between 3-dimension and 2-dimensional art. I'm finding it quite a challenge. I made a cylinder of acrylic plastic. So you had this round object with walls. I painted the top edge and I put the thing on paper and I looked at it and it appeared that the color had transferred itself to the upper end. So I was seeing both red at the bottom and red at the top. It was a transference of energy, really. The question is, what do you do with that observation? Well, I made some pieces which I think are engaging and interesting. And the question is, how far can I take that? She's very inventive. She put together a book, for example, on my last 15 years of fooling around with chemistry. I wrote a book on those kinds of polymers, and she organized the design of that book. The thing which is most satisfying to me has to deal with molecular beauty, making new things, potentially useful things. Outstanding example would be a new way of causing rings to open. If you imagine that you take a molecule that's round and you find a way to split it that way, and the thing that causes that ring to open is an initiator. So you initiate ring opening. There's certain kinds of reactions that are just plain beautiful. And so you have this interaction between art and science. Yeah.
Walk together, children, don't you get weary. There's a great camp meeting in the promised land. Sing together, children, don't you get weary. Sing together, children, I ain't getting no waste time. Sing together, children, don't you get weary. There's a great camp meeting in the promised land. Going to walk and never tire, don't you get tired. I'm going to walk and never tire, don't you tire. Going to walk and never tire. There's a great camp meeting in the promised land. You better pray together, children, don't you get weary. Pray together, children, I ain't feeling no waste time. You better pray together, children, don't you get weary. There's a great camp meeting in the promised land. Walk and never tire, don't you get tired. I'm going to walk and never tire, don't you tire. Going to walk and never tire. There's a great camp meeting in the promised land. Oh, shout together, children, you get weary. Shout together, children, no, I ain't about to tire. Oh, shout together, children, you get weary. There's a great camp meeting in the promised land. Going to walk, sing, pray, shout, never tire. Just going to walk, sing, pray, shout, never tire, never tire. Going to walk.